Welcome to the Joshua Ngoma podcast for spiritual inspiration and Africa's strategy positioning in global politics.
Kenneth Kaunda, the freedom fighter. Kenneth David Kaunda was Zambia's founding president. He became president in 1964 at Zambia's independence from Great Britain and later became an iconic figure in the liberation struggle against colonization and apartheid in Africa. His influence on leadership in the fight for the right to vote or universal suffrage and for the Africans to determine their own destinies was a worldwide phenomenon. Kaunda's leadership was felt and respected in the Southern African region, where he spoke with much candor to the apartheid regime in South Africa. He also spoke boldly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East and to the American presidents and the British prime ministers about the agency of ending colonization in Africa. European nations such as Great Britain, Belgium, France, Germany, and Portugal held big stakes in the colonization of the Africans. There were pivotal lessons learned that would inform us as to how we lay a foundation based on a blueprint for a modern continent and the possibility of a United States of Africa. Our competitiveness, quest for relevance, progress, and success on the global scale is predicated on how we build and respect our democratic institutions and on how we implement prudent economic policies that guarantee prosperity and bring dignity to the African person by uplifting them and their living standards from abject poverty. Zambia is a landlocked country and has no outlet to either the Indian Ocean on the east or the Atlantic Ocean on the west. At independence, it was still surrounded by some of its neighbors who were dominated by white colonial rule. Mozambique and Angola were under Portuguese domination. Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was under a white rule government led by Ian Douglas Smith, who declared unilateral independence from Britain in 1965. Zambia also shared a border with Southwest Africa, now Namibia, which was initially under German control and was later taken over by the apartheid South African government. Zambia, under the leadership of Kenneth Kaunda, became the hub of liberation movements in the Southern Africa region. It actively supported the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, and later the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA. Zambia also supported the African National Congress, ANC of South Africa, and the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, of Namibia. Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union Patriotic Front, ZAPU-PF, also operated mainly from Zambia. Kaunda would not spare no expense from the coffers of his young nation to ensure that universal suffrage became a right for every African person. Liberation in some African nations came at a high price, both in terms of the loss of human life and in treasure. This generation of Africans should not lose sight of the struggle for self-rule that our forebears endured, ridding our continent of colonial rule and apartheid. Kenneth Kaunda estimated that Zambia spent 20 billion United States dollars in support of the liberation movements in Southern Africa in the fight for universal suffrage. President Kaunda stated that, quote, by 1994, when universal elections took place in South Africa, which was the pillar of racism in our region, Zambia and the frontline states had lost thousands of lives, lost economic opportunities, and had got into debt because of the freedom struggle in Southern Africa. In monetary terms, Zambia lost in excess of $20 billion. Zambia would have done much better had it not been for the human, material, and other economic costs of the political and armed struggle in Southern Africa. However, this was the price of our principles. Of course, it is possible that this could have been done differently and perhaps more efficiently. I don't know. Or things could have been worse. I don't know. End of quote. At the invitation of the United States President Gerald R. Ford at the White House, Kaunda was unequivocal at what he perceived as America's passive stance towards the end of colonial rule in Africa. Quote, Mr. President, to build genuine peace in Southern Africa, we must recognize with honesty the root causes of the existing conflict. First, colonialism in Rhodesia and Namibia. The existence of a rebel regime in Rhodesia has since compounded that problem. Second, apartheid and racial domination in South Africa. Over the last few years, a number of catalytic factors have given strength to these forces of evil. External economic and strategic interests have flourished in colonial and apartheid regimes. Realism and moral conscience dictate that those who believe in peace must join hands in promoting conditions for peace. We cannot declare our commitment to peace and yet strengthen forces that stand in the way of the attainment of that peace. The era of colonialism has ended. Apartheid cannot endure the test of time. Our obligation is that these evil systems end peacefully. To achieve our aim, we need America's total commitment to action consistent with that aim. So far, American policy, let alone action, has been low-keyed. This has given psychological comfort to the forces of evil. We become, Mr. President, even more dismayed when the current posture of America towards Africa is set against the background of historical performance in the late 50s and early 60s. Now we ask and wonder what has happened throughout America. Have the principles changed? The aspirations of the oppressed have not changed at all. In desperation, their anger has exploded their patience. Their resolve to fight if peaceful negotiations are impossible is borne out by history. So, their struggle has now received the baptism of fire. Victories in Mozambique and Angola have given them added inspiration. Africa has no reason at all, not to support the liberation movements. Can America still end only with declarations of support for the principles of freedom and racial justice? This, I submit, Mr. President, would not be enough. At this time, America cannot realistically wait and see what administering powers would do or to pledge to support their efforts when none are in plan. America must heed the call of the oppressed. America, once an apostle in decolonization, must not be a mere disciple of those which promise but never perform, and thus give strength to the evils of colonialism and apartheid. If we want peace, we must end the era of inertia in Rhodesia and in Namibia and vigorously work for the ending of apartheid. America must now be in the vanguard of a democratic revolution in Southern Africa. This is not the first time we make this appeal. It is Africa's constant plea. Now, Africa has taken an unequivocal stand on decolonization. We do not want to fight a war to win freedom and full national independence in Southern Africa. Africa wants to achieve these objectives by peaceful means, that is, through negotiations. We feel it to be our moral duty to avoid bloodshed where we can. We are determined to fulfill this obligation, but Mr. President, not at any price, not at any price, not at the price of freedom and justice. There we say, no, no. Kaunda and the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Kaunda would often butt heads with Britain's Iron Lady, the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. This was mainly over Britain's inertia concerning the end of the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, by Ian Douglas Smith in southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and apartheid in South Africa. White settlers, led by Ian Douglas Smith, had in November of 1965 forcibly taken over authority from the British Crown by declaring Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, in southern Rhodesia. When Prime Minister Thatcher came into office as leader of Britain in 1979, most African nations were asserting their independence from colonization. Through the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, now known as the African Union, AU, these nations spoke with a united voice, pressing Western governments to rescind their support for UDI in southern Rhodesia and apartheid in South Africa. Many of these African states were also members of the Non-Aligned Movement group of nations that dedicated themselves to being independent of the Cold War polarization of the Eastern and Western blocs. These African governments felt that Britain's prime ministers had in the past acted softly on the southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe issue, and white-ruled rest South Africa. They also felt that Britain was complicit, directly or indirectly, for the regimes to survive through evading various worldwide sanctions. A Heads of Government Commonwealth meeting, CHOGM, was held in August 1979 in Zambia's capital city of Lusaka. This was a club meeting which helped turn southern Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. Zambia's President Kenneth Kaunda chaired the meeting. Mrs. Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister of Britain for 3 months only. African governments in the Commonwealth were concerned that the British government would use the Lusaka conference to push them towards harsh IMF economic policies. They were equally concerned that Britain would again block efforts towards a genuine resolution of the Southern Rhodesia question by giving blacks a pathway to self-determination. There was anxiety on the part of many African leaders prior to the Lusaka meeting. They anticipated that Thatcher would live up to her reputation as the Iron Lady, or a bossy-looking blonde Prime Minister of Britain, by openly exhibiting tough resistance and unyielding to views of the African governments. Thatcher's toughness was only rated second place to that of Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Britain's conservative or Tory circles. The Zambian team was up to the task in facilitating this historic conference. They organized a dinner dance, and to break the ice, Kenneth Kaunda danced with Margaret Thatcher, and his wife, Mrs. Kaunda, danced with Mr. Dennis Thatcher, the Prime Minister's husband. Prime Minister Thatcher was not well and had nothing to eat for 24 hours because of a severe stomach upset when she took to the dance floor with President Kenneth Kaunda. An aide to Margaret Thatcher said, "I thought she was going to faint at one moment," he recalled. She did terribly well at Lusaka. She really was brilliant. She had never been to Africa, and I think she thought there were a lot of savages. When they turned up, and Kaunda was a smooth old guy, and they were all agreeable, I think she thawed a bit. Kaunda, the smooth old guy, did terribly well with his country's display of traditional African hospitality towards a British dignitary. To this day, Kaunda often referred to the late Mrs. Thatcher as my dancing partner. Kaunda and Thatcher were contemporaries. Mrs. Thatcher was born in October 1925 and Kenneth Kaunda in April 1924. The gathering was harmonious, and the end result of this meeting was unexpectedly successful. An agreement was finally reached, and Great Britain agreed to get back control of the territory of Southern Rhodesia from Ian Smith, and the transition towards independence and universal elections would follow. Consequently, at Her Majesty's government invitation, a meeting on Zimbabwe's independence was convened at Lancaster House in London from September to December of 1979. Later that year, the meeting was held under the chairmanship of Lord Carrington, then Britain's Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Margaret Thatcher invited Kenneth Kaunda as a standby to intercede in case there were problems in the negotiations that worked out practically the details of the transition to majority black rule in Zimbabwe. Economic sanctions against the apartheid government. In 1960, pressure mounted on South Africa's apartheid government through international economic sanctions, and they would start taking effect in the 1980s. In 1962, the United Nations established a special committee against apartheid, which called for sanctions against the apartheid South African government. But Britain was not convinced that this would encourage a change of policy in South Africa, and consequently boycotted the committee. Margaret Thatcher remained adamant in her disapproval of sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Britain was indifferent in spite of the fact that most Western and newly independent African countries supported the economic isolation of South Africa. At a Commonwealth meeting in 1986, disagreements concerning the sanctions against South Africa ensued and escalated to epic proportions. Prime Minister Thatcher maintained Britain's stance that the economic sanctions would achieve little or nothing at ending the apartheid rule. She insisted that sanctions would, in turn, lead to the greater suffering of South Africa's black population at large. Kenneth Kaunda, with other Commonwealth leaders, strongly felt that the apartheid government should be forced to undergo a policy change through economic isolation. In a rather unprecedented move, Kaunda suggested that Prime Minister Thatcher be excluded from talks on South African sanctions. Thatcher's support for the apartheid government in South Africa was at the zenith of its deadliest attacks, killing many in the late 1980s in state-sponsored terrorism at home and abroad. The apartheid regime carried out bombings and cross-border raids on neighboring nations such as Mozambique and Zambia, accused of harboring the African National Congress military wing, the Umkhonto weSizwe's guerrilla fighters. Thatcher and Britain had also branded Mandela and his African National Congress movement terrorist. They were accused of receiving backing from the former Soviet Union during the Cold War era and because of its guerrilla war for democracy. Under the public's glare of television cameras, President Kenneth Kaunda lectured Britain's Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Hall. This incident happened at his visit to Lusaka in August of 1986. Kenneth Kaunda publicly accused Britain's envoy and President Reagan of kissing South African apartheid. Hall had visited the Zambian leader on a European Community's peace mission. He flew into Lusaka from Johannesburg, where he met South African President Pieter W. Botha, leading South African businessmen and white opposition politicians. Kaunda told Secretary Hall, who listened in silence, that, quote, "As a fellow human being, Sir Geoffrey, I must welcome you, but as a messenger of what you have come to do in South Africa, you are not welcome at all." End of quote. Kaunda had deep respect and love for Queen Elizabeth II of England. It was for this reason alone, and the fact that Sir Geoffrey Hall represented 12 other nations of the European Community, that Kaunda had even extended his hand of welcome to him in Lusaka. Sir Hall denied Kaunda's accusation by saying that he was trying to end apartheid peacefully rather than through violence. Mr. Hall replied, quote, "There is no foundation whatsoever to your suggestion that there is a conspiracy of the kind you suggest." End of quote. But President Kaunda further said, quote, "Sir Geoffrey, you people will not be forgiven by history. I will tell you that because this thing is about to explode." End of quote. Kenneth Kaunda versus Ronald Reagan. Kaunda was also visibly angered by United States President Ronald Reagan's speech earlier opposing stronger U.S. economic sanctions against the apartheid government in Pretoria. Kaunda felt that Reagan's speech was a clear encouragement and a signal to white South Africans that Britain and the United States were in support of apartheid. Kaunda openly accused President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of a conspiracy to defend white supremacy in South Africa by resisting international pressure for sanctions. In the United States, Mandela and the ANC were placed on a terrorist watch list by the Reagan administration. This action by Reagan labeled Mandela as being dangerous and subversive. This status remained unchanged for many years to come. Mandela was a terrorist in the eyes of some Western governments because a hero and liberator in the eyes of millions of Black South Africans and well-wishers all over the world. Mandela remained on the terrorist watch list even after being released from prison after 27 years in 1990 and the official unbanning of the ANC as a political party. Zambia's fourth president, Rupia Banda, recalled with fond memories how Nelson Mandela made Zambia his first foreign country of choice to visit. 16 days after leaving Victor Vesta prison after 27 years of incarceration. This visit was in honor of Zambia's pivotal role in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and colonialism in Africa at large. Former President Banda was governor of Lusaka when Mandela visited the Zambian capital on February 27, 1990. He recalls that he was the first Zambian government official to shake hands with him as he alighted from a Zambia Airways plane to mark his first visit outside South Africa in 27 years. Governor Banda honored Mandela also with the status of the free man of the city of Lusaka during the historic visit. Mandela became the first democratic elected president of South Africa in 1994 and graciously retired after one term in office, but his name was still kept on the terrorist list in the United States. As late as 2007, ANC officials, including former President of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who sought to travel to the United States, still had to get a State Department waiver or special certification to enter the country. Even for his 2005 visit with President George W. Bush, Mandela had to get a waiver. The Reagan administration strongly resisted demands that American corporations and nonprofit organizations divest their financial investments in South Africa. The Reagan administration also refused to support United Nations international trade sanctions and an arms embargo against apartheid South Africa. They instead believed that Mr. Mandela and the ANC were Cuban-backed, thereby causing a communist threat to South Africa and by extension to US investments in that nation. This embarrassing issue finally hit the fan in 2008 when Barbara Masekela, the former South African ambassador to the United States, was denied a visa to visit a dying cousin in the United States. Then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, under the Bush administration, called it embarrassing, and she urged Congress to remove Mandela and the ANC from the terrorist watch list. In April of 2008, the Secretary of State made it clear she would not tolerate the American government's travel restrictions still in place against Nelson Mandela and the ruling African National Congress. Up until then, all of them still had to apply for a special waiver to enter the United States. She told Congress that it was deeply embarrassing for her to have to wave in her own counterpart, the Foreign Minister of South Africa, not to mention the great leader, Nelson Mandela. With a big nudge from the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress finally voted to remove the now 90-year-old Mandela and the ANC from the United States government's official terrorist watch list. President Bush signed the bill in July 2008 without hesitation after Senate passage and closed a 40-year branding of Mandela as a political terrorist by the United States government. Thank you for watching and listening. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Joshua Ngoma podcast. Bye for now until next time.